So we're back and we're going to finish talking about organizing your speech. And this is part 2 of methods for organizing your speech. And we're going to kind of get into, there's different ways that you can put your speech together depending upon your topic and depending upon your rhetorical purpose. Mostly we're going to focus on your basic informative speech, because persuasive speaking has its own way of putting information together. And so pretty much what I'm going to give you is how to put your basic informative, or maybe even a speech to entertain, how to put that together. So let me pull up the PowerPoint. Here we go. And this is just kind of a reminder of, what does a well-organized speech have? So the first thing it has is unity among those points, right? That all those points are implied by the purpose and thesis statement. And that each point supports your thesis. Your thesis will be in your introduction. And the supporting points all support that main point. And the sub-supporting points support the supporting point. We talked about that already when I went over what that outline looked like in the previous lecture. It should have coherence, should be logical and concise, and should make sense. And it should be clear, right? You want to use language that we understand. And if there's language, you're using language, whether it's technical jargon or whether it's a language that that's not English, we need an explanation of what that word means or how that's used or why you're using it. There needs to be clarity in your speech. Don't assume. There are certain things you can assume that we know, but don't assume too much, right? And remember, I'm in your audience as well. I think I told you early on that like 3 years ago, maybe only 2 years ago, I learned who Cardi B was. So I'm not that aware of everything. So know that I'm a little older than you, come from a different generation. So consider you need to have clarity in your speech and explain where it needs to be. So introduction naturally leads to the body of the speech, that naturally leads to conclusion. So that's what I mean about, think about logos, Aristotle and logos. There's a flow, there's a coherence. One thing works, falls. It's like it doesn't have to be sequential, but it naturally flows from one thing to the other. And then there should be balance. So we talked about this already. Equal balance, equal weight given to each main point within as it goes along to describe or explain your topic. Okay. So all speeches have a way that they organize, a method for organizing their ideas, and it's driven by the purpose and topic of your speech. So how do we do that? So the organizational pattern is relevant for 2 reasons. It should reflect the purpose of the speaker's speech. In this case, it's your rhetorical purpose. And it should also, you should also consider what is going to be the best method to clearly deliver your speech. What is the best way to do that, right? If you're giving a speech about a person, and we're going to talk about all these different ways, but if you're giving a speech about a person, you're not going to want to use, no, I take that back. You might want to use this method, but the best method would be, if you're going to give a speech about a person, is either going to be chronological, like you're going to go over the person's life from beginning to end, or like if it's a historical person that's already died, you're going to talk from beginning to end. It's called chronological. Or you could talk about it in a narrative, like tell us the story about the person's life. So let's get right into it. Chronological. Chronological means time, right? Temporal. The word temporal refers to time. Time means sequential. Then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Just like the way the way we live our lives from beginning to end, from birth to death. There's a chronology that happens, right? Now, if you're giving a speech about a person's life, Chronological pattern is a good way to do it. If you're giving a speech about an event, something that requires you to tell a sequence. If you're giving a speech on how to do something, how-to speeches require chronology because there's a sequence. There's one step, then another step, then another step. So a speech describes a series of developments in time or a set of actions that occur sequentially. Spatial pattern. If you're giving a speech that actually relates to the physical arrangements of a place, object, or event, that's what we call is a spatial pattern. So you would actually, your main points would revolve around these physical places and their relationship to each other. This could be if you're giving a speech, maybe you're giving a speech about a museum exhibit. Like, for example, I love Frida Kahlo, and I've seen Frida Kahlo in a couple different museums. And let's say we're going to give a speech about that, my experience in that. And usually in Frida Kahlo, it's actually an exhibit, and they'll have different paintings, like maybe paintings. The paintings, if you don't know who this author is, you should look her up. Frida Kahlo. She was paralyzed, or she had hurt her back. She had been in a car accident. She painted. That's how she really got into painting, I think, even more so. She painted while she was on her back, and she laid on her back and painted. And she painted about her kind of excruciating pain that she was in. So maybe if I were going to give a speech about that, if the paintings were arranged in like her pre-accident, during her accident, and then after accident, that's what I meant is a physical arrangement of these paintings here, these paintings there, these paintings there. So it's actually something that is, you can imagine, physically placed next to each other in their relationship to each other. An event, the art hop is another example of what that would work. Could be, you could even talk about the fair, right? If you talk about a certain area in the fair, you could talk about, spatial pattern could relate to, students like to give speeches about Disneyland, right? That falls under spatial pattern. Let's go back to that. I want to say something about Disneyland. The thing about Disneyland, in order to do Disneyland justice, if you really wanted to give a good speech about Disneyland, I would pick an area in the park to talk about, like Tomorrowland, or I haven't been to Disneyland in so long, or Pirates of the Caribbean, whatever area that's called, or Frontierland, right? That would be a smaller, and you get more in depth on what's going on. Maybe even gave a speech about the Matterhorn. There's a lot going on with the Matterhorn, stories about the Matterhorn. Or your speech is about the secret places in Disneyland. I had a student give a speech about that. Like in the Matterhorn, within the Matterhorn, there's a basketball court, and knowing where all those secret places are. I think you get the gist. Okay, spatial pattern, topical pattern. This is what most of you are going to do. This is basically, you've got 3 main points of equal value, and they center around your main idea. They represent a separate aspect, and they can be arranged in any way. Okay, most of you are going to give that. Let's say you're going to talk about, I don't know, your personal symbol. Let's see, my personal symbol is, since I'm a teacher, it's the red apple. So I break that down and I talk about the apple as, how did the apple come to symbolize? Apple is a symbol, right? Apple is a symbol of Apple computer. Apple is a symbol of something like that you give teachers. And apples, it has this nutritional symbol, right? They're all separate, and I could talk about them in any order. Most of you will be doing it like that. Comparison pattern. If you're going to compare things two different things, the key about comparison pattern is this. They have to be within the same genre. So you have to compare things that are similar. You can't compare, and obviously in comparison, you're comparing things that are similar, but you're talking about how they're different because you're comparing them. If you were to give a speech about Now this is not going to fit in your personal symbol speech, but let's just say you were going to give a speech and you wanted to compare things. You wanted to compare the Android to the iPhone. About 4 or 5 years ago, that was a popular speech to give. Not so much now, but it was a popular speech. When you do that, this is what's hard about doing a speech like that, is you really need a visual aid, you need a presentation aid to show us when you're talking about the iPhone and when you're talking about the Android. Because sometimes it can get confusing and it can sound redundant if you keep talking about one and they keep switching back and forth. It'd be better to have a visual so you could point to what you're talking about. But they have to be in the same genre. You can't talk about, I had a student give a speech about Burning Man and Coachella. They're totally two different reasons for having events. The only thing they have in common is there's probably some dancing and drugs. Aside from that, they have nothing in common. If you know anything about Burning Man, it's not a concert. Coachella is. Okay, this is the last one, and after this we're going to finish. It's called the narrative pattern, where you actually give a speech and you tell it like a story. Can be a series of vignettes, or you can tell it like a complete story from beginning to end. Usually this kind of speech contains elements such as the characters in your story, some plot, setting, and imagery. So it takes a lot for you. If you're going to use a narrative pattern, you need to really build up. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Who was involved? What did they look like? What did they do? How did they sound? Right? In a good story, those are the elements that engage and capture your audience. So if you're going to use this kind of pattern to deliver your speech, you really need to work on all of your storytelling skills. Okay, I'm going to come back to this because we're done. So that completes us for the organizational piece, methods for organizing your speech. That should give you an idea, a backdrop in how you're going to approach your first speech. We're not looking in your first speech, we're just looking at how do you organize it and how you should go about organizing your speech so it's going to make sense. Okay, great. You guys can do this. I know you can. I'll see you later.